Over the last week, I've been using the Huawei Nexus 6P as my main phone. Today, I decided to talk about the specifications of the phone and review them to let people know if it's worth buying. This is the Nexus 6P specs video. Hello everybody, my name is Matt and this is Real World Review. What I'm going to do is go over the specs of the phone, and at the end I will score the phone based on my personal experiences as a user and cell phone repairman. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below or on Twitter at @MattofRWR. Let's get started. To start, our first category is the outside hardware. Let's start with that display. The display is a 5.7-inch AMOLED screen with a resolution of 1440 by 2560, totaling 518 pixels per inch. At a screen brightness of about 335 nits, it is about half the brightness of an iPhone 7. There is Corning Gorilla Glass covering the AMOLED display, making the front scratch resistant. The screen-to-body ratio is about 72% and the touch buttons are on the screen. Let's talk about the rest of the front. We start at the top where the earpiece and the sensors are. There's a speaker grill that covers one of the dual front-facing speakers, and to the left of that is an 8-megapixel front camera. Below that to the right are the proximity and ambient light sensors. Above the sensors is one of the 3 microphones. To the left of the speaker grill is an LED for notifications. On the bottom portion is the second loudspeaker along with the second hidden microphone to the left of that. This means that the phone does indeed have dual front-facing speakers that work at the same time, unlike the LG Nexus 5X. Moving on to the frame. On the bottom is a USB-C 2.0 port and 2 antenna lines. On the right side there are 2 antenna lines along with the volume buttons and a power button. On the left side there are 2 more antenna lines along with a SIM card tray. And on the top of the phone there are 2 more antenna lines and a headset jack. On the back of the device, there are 4 antenna lines that connect to the black camera lens, which is stuck on the top portion of the large metal back. The Gorilla Glass 4 panel houses a 12.3 megapixel rear camera, a dual LED flash, and a laser autofocus component. Under the glass panel is a third microphone, and below that is a fingerprint scanner. On the bottom is a plastic panel with nothing on it. I don't know why it's there. As for the size, the device is 159.3 millimeters tall, 77.8 millimeters wide, and 7.3 millimeters thick, or 6.27 inches tall, 3.06 inches wide, and 0.29 inches thick. As for the weight, the Nexus 6P is 178 grams, or 6.28 ounces. The phone is not water resistant and does not have a user removable battery or back. And now we move on to the cameras. The rear camera is a 12.3 megapixel sensor with a dual LED flash. The aperture is f2.0 and the pixel size is 1.55 micrometers. The phone supports different camera features like laser autofocus, panorama, photosphere, and high dynamic range. The rear camera can record video in some limited ways. It can record 4K, 1080p, and 720p, all at 30 frames per second, and slow motion video can be captured at only 720p at 120 or 240 frames per second. The front camera is an 8-megapixel sensor with an f2.4 aperture, and the pixel size is 1.4 micrometers. It allows for a max of 1080p recording at 30 frames per second. The next category is the inside hardware. As usual, we start with the processor. The processor in this phone is a 64-bit Qualcomm Snapdragon 810 version 2.1 chip. It is a 20nm octa-core processor with 4 cores running at 2.0 GHz and 4 cores running at 1.55 GHz. Geekbench gives the phone a score of around 1,370 for single-core and 3,525 for multi-core test. The GPU is an Adreno 430 that runs at 650 MHz. When testing the GPU, Geekbench gives the phone a score of around 5,988. The phone has 3GB of LPDDR4 RAM, which works fine in this flagship phone. The model I'm reviewing is the H1511, which is factory unlocked. The phone supports 1G, 2G, 3G, and 4G, assuming that the market that you're in still supports those. It also supports LTE bands 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 12, 13, 17, 25, 29, 30, and 41. As for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi chip is a 802.11 AC 2x2 MIMO, and the Bluetooth is version 4.2. This phone also supports NFC, AGPS, and GLONASS. The battery is a 3,450 mAh lithium-ion battery that is supposed to last all day. Google claims that the battery will give you up to 23 hours of talk time and 18 days of standby time. The USB-C port does support rapid charging and should charge the phone up to 100% in about an hour and a half. Sadly, there is no wireless charging due to the metal back. The phone comes out of the box with Android 6.0 Marshmallow and was updated to Android 8.0. It is assumed that the phone will be updated to Android P whenever that comes out. The phone supports a few different audio formats like FLAC, MP3, M4A, and WAV. As for video playback, the phone supports a few formats like H.264 and MPEG-4. Now that we've gone over the specs, it's time for us to give this phone a score. Note that the phone comes with 32, 64, or 128 gigabytes and cannot be purchased new anymore, but can be found used for about $250. It should also be noted that this phone is almost 2 years old, and most people will be buying this phone used, and the scoring does account for that. Let's start with the frame. The phone is made out of mainly aluminum and glass. The front is mainly glass, but the back is metal with a piece of glass on the top and plastic on the bottom. There is an issue with bending, but it shouldn't be too much of a concern. The aluminum is very soft, and after a few drops, some dents will show up. There is glass protruding on the back, and some claim that it will shatter on its own, but I am very doubtful. Since the glass is curved, it will most likely break easier than most camera covers, but still, just don't drop the phone. The screen is an AMOLED display, making it easier to break if dropped, but the glass holds up pretty well. My screen has a decent amount of scratches and dents on it, and there's still no cracks. Sure, it doesn't apply to every phone, but it is surprising because this phone looks like it's been through a lot. They tried to make the phone very premium, but it falls short, so I will give the outside hardware a 7 out of 10. Next is the screen. The screen is amazing, but it is a little off. When you use a phone with AMOLED screen, you know that there are some downsides. Sure, the picture is amazing, especially watching video in the dark, but there are some downsides. These screens produce the most accurate blacks on a phone, and this is no different. The issue I had with the screen is that it is not very bright. When you're inside during the day, you won't notice much of a difference. But when you're in direct sunlight, it is almost impossible to read the screen. Still, it looks good in almost every other situation I had the phone in, so I don't feel like this should be a deal breaker. The screen size is 5.7 inches, but it is pretty much the same size as the Nexus 6, which had a 5.96 inch screen. The screen to body ratio is almost 72%, but the top and the bottom bezels are much larger than the Nexus 6. Overall, the screen is still very clean, so I will give it an 8 out of 10. Next is the inside hardware. The Snapdragon 810 processor is fast, but there are some issues. The phone is a couple years old, and it may not be a concern for some, but it should be for this phone. This phone is known for the boot loop issue and is caused by the processor in most cases. With this said, it does get the job done, but the phone heats up very quickly. The good thing is that the phone just gets warm and not scalding hot like some other phones. There is a good amount of RAM in this phone, but there were times when I would get stuck on a white screen when loading an app, like this. The 3450 mAh battery is actually pretty large, but will last about a day. I don't see the phone lasting longer than a day, but that's not that big of an issue. Most of the components on the inside are replaceable, so that is somewhat of a bonus. There is support for only one SIM card and no support for a memory card. This may not be an issue, but after installing a few apps, I was left with 18 gigabytes of storage on this 32 gigabyte phone. I would recommend buying a phone with a higher amount of memory if possible. The camera lacks optical image stabilization, which does not help with recording. It sounds like this phone is bad, but it really isn't. It's actually a really good phone, so I will still give the inside hardware a 7.5 out of 10. It is 2017 after all. Next is the camera. The camera is not bad, but I wasn't too impressed. Sure, the camera was amazing for 2015, but it is aging in 2017. The camera takes amazing pictures, but when compared to phones like the iPhone 7 and the Samsung S8 Plus, the camera is not as good. The overall image is fine, but the color is not as accurate as it should be. The camera focus is very fast with a laser autofocus, but it is lacking optical image stabilization. The front camera is not bad at all, but maybe that's a bad thing. The front camera seems to show more features on my face, so that might be bad for some people. The colors also seem to be more accurate on the front camera when compared to the back camera. I did have an issue with the back camera the other day when taking a picture of food. There was some waviness to the camera and it stayed when I took the picture. It only happened once, but the point is that it did happen. I didn't have a case or anything like that to mess up the camera, so it had to be something with the phone. Regardless, this 12.3 megapixel camera does support 4K video at 30 frames per second, which is fine, but here's the thing. 720p, 1080p, and 4K can only be recorded at 30 frames per second. With the iPhone 6 capturing 1080p at 60 frames per second and the iPhone 8 capturing 4K at 60 frames per second, the Nexus 6P camera is clearly not the best for recording. With all this said, the camera is average for 2017, but still gets an 8 out of 10. Next is the software. This phone comes with Android 6.0 Marshmallow and has been recently upgraded to Android 8.0 Oreo. While these updates have been much needed, there are still some things that I've become accustomed to, whether we are talking about other companies and their additions to Android or the rooting and custom software scene. The Nexus phones are known to be highly customizable and are extremely easy to modify software-wise. This phone is no different, but for this review, I'm keeping the phone stock. The software is easy to use and there aren't too many confusing pieces of software, except for the settings. However, the settings app does have a search option, so that helps out. Sure, there are some things that are missing, but overall, pure Android experience is refreshing. Since a fingerprint scanner will unlock the phone, there isn't a need for a physical button on the front or a way to double tap to turn on the screen, unless you don't have your fingerprint set up. Everything is straightforward, and when you link Google to your phone, it will actually bring up some useful things. Overall, I had no issues with the software other than the fact that this is probably the last major software update that the Nexus 6P will get. The software never gets put into the scoring, but I'll still give it a 9 out of 10. The last score is the future-proofing score. This phone came out a couple years ago, so most of the issues should have popped up by now. The major issues that happen with this phone are obviously the boot loop issue, battery issue, and the lack of external storage. The boot loop issue is generally caused by the processor or the battery. The Snapdragon 810 processor is known for overheating, so it isn't too surprising when these processors do fail. The phone that I'm using is over a year and a half old, and I haven't had any issues with the battery or the processor, except for the fact that the phone gets hot really easily. The issue with the battery is that it will cause the phone to power off at early percentages, rather than quickly draining. It is not too difficult to change the battery, but there are a few pieces that are at risk when you do change it. Next, wireless charging, external storage, and optical image stabilization are all missing from this phone. OTG is supported through the USB-C port, but it isn't the same as just putting an SD card into your phone. While the front-facing speakers are nice, they do sound very quiet. The speakers in my phone may be failing, but either way it's not good for future use. The phone does have a USB-C charger, so it is ready for the future, but that's about it. It is already on Android Oreo and will most likely not see Android P, but that's okay. The Snapdragon 810 processor isn't that bad and handles Oreo well, but there are times where it struggles to get the job done. With this said, my issues with this phone really are the size of the phone and that the processor doesn't really blow my mind now that it is 2017. So to answer the question, I think that this phone is not future-proof and will get a 6.5 out of 10. Add up the scores and this phone gets a 37 out of 50, or 74%. This is the first Huawei phone that I've ever used and I really liked it, but I believe that Google is the reason that I liked it. I've always been a fan of stock Android and this is exactly what that is. The software lacks some features like LG's knock-on or an always-on display, but that's what rooting is for. The phone is easy to get root access and customize it how you want as long as you're up for that challenge. I definitely wouldn't have purchased this phone brand new, but now that the phones are under $250, it's definitely worth a purchase. And that's it. Let me know what else you want me to review in the comment section below, and I have a question for you guys. How important is wireless charging and removable storage to you? Let me know. Thanks for watching.